Intro video here to the discussion board assignment, Drawn to Summits, Political Cartoons on President Reagan and the Arms Race. So this is a fun assignment. We get to look at about a dozen political cartoons. We're going to, not only is that enjoyable, but we're also going to learn how to use those as historical sources. So everything you need here, if you go to the discussion board folder, is in one file, and you know, in this file there's the introduction, you have your analysis table, the actual sources and questions. So let's go through the introduction that gives us the context and background. And I just want to reiterate, a lot of these political cartoons, they're not going to make sense to you unless you carefully read the introduction and you have that historical knowledge to understand these cartoons. So please carefully read the intro and use it as background and context because it'll help you understand the cartoons. So in Reagan's first term, he was elected in 1980, and in his first term, he called the Soviet Union, he called Russia an evil empire. He had very bellicose rhetoric towards the Soviets, meaning he was very, very hawkish, a very hostile stance toward the Soviets. Reagan believed that Soviet Union in the Cold War was a threat to world peace. He also believed that if he ramped up American military spending, that would convince the Soviets to back down. It would convince them to come to the negotiating table. And he also believed that it would convince the Soviets to try and match American military spending, and that would bankrupt their economy. And so this was sort of Reagan's strategy. Once again, he was very hawkish towards the Soviets, and the results of this was U.S. defense spending on the military in Reagan's first term was up 40%. Now, the government's spending more on the military, but Reagan also lowered taxes, which means the government's receiving less money. And so in Reagan's first term, there's a huge federal budget deficit. The U.S. debt ballooned because of this. Now, how did the Soviets respond to Reagan's hard line in his first term? Well, they didn't back down like Reagan expected them. The Soviets believed, the Americans are going to come attacking us. They're building up their military. There's going to be an attack. So tensions and the possibility of nuclear war was as high as it had been probably since the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s. Tensions were high. The Soviets shot down a Korean civilian airliner in 1983. And nuclear war was a possibility. So leading into Reagan's second term, 1984 and afterwards, beginning in 1985, he was reelected in 84, Reagan realized, we have to avoid nuclear war. Maybe I took too much of a hardline stance in my first term. And so beginning in 84 and 85, Reagan softened his rhetoric. He said, no, I want to ease tensions with the Russians. I want to work to reduce nuclear weapons. I want to talk. The Russians are not this evil empire anymore. I want to avoid nuclear war. Reagan was helped in this. In 1985, the Russians got a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was a reformer and who was also willing to talk and wanted to talk about arms control negotiations and reduce nuclear weapons as well. So what the result was between 1985 and 1988 were four major summits, four major meetings between Reagan as leader of the United States and Mikhail Gorbachev as leader of the Soviet Union. And in these summits, these are very high-profile summits. You'll see a couple of the political cartoons reference these summits. There was talk of arms control negotiations. There was talk of actually eliminating all nuclear weapons. And Reagan and Gorbachev came to have this sort of very friendly relationship. On page 291 and 292, it takes you through those four summits. Now pay attention to that because there's a lot of specifics there that you'll find in the political cartoons that you won't really understand what's going on in the political cartoon unless you really closely read the details of these summits. Things like SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars, and other things like that are very specific to these cartoons. So make sure to pay attention to that. Now let's go to the subheading, using political cartoons as sources. What can political cartoons tell us? One of the first things is political cartoonists use caricature to tell us about the subject. So caricature is drawing a person, place, or thing so realistically that you can immediately identify that person, place, or thing, but exaggerating it wildly, exaggerating elements of it wildly to make a point or put forth a message. So by looking at caricature, we can learn about the subject of the cartoon. The second way that we can use political cartoons as sources is, political cartoons won't work unless the viewer, unless the public are informed about current events, where they get the joke, they get the message. So we can look at political cartoons and we can assume that, someone in 1983, the public was probably aware of what the Strategic Defense Initiative was, SDI, or the public was well versed in these summits between Reagan and Gorbachev, that they would open up their local newspaper and get the message of this political cartoon. So these political cartoons can give us a window into what were common current events that your ordinary American would get. So for example, if you don't read the introduction to these sources, you're not going to get the political cartoons. So again, we can assume that Americans had knowledge of these current events to get the punchline here. With that, use the checklist on page 296 and the analysis table on page 297 and 298 to help you focus on what's important in these cartoons, to help you keep track of your notes. And from there, page 299 to 311 are the political cartoons themselves, the sources. You're going to be looking at 13 political cartoons focusing on different aspects of Ronald Reagan's domestic and foreign policy. Once you got that and you have your notes in the analysis table, look at page 312. Here there are 6 questions. I want you to answer all 6. I want you to respond to all 6 of these questions. Once again, you guys know the drill by now. Looking for a minimum detailed paragraph with specific references to the sources, to the political cartoons. 2 or 3 sentences isn't sufficient. You're going to post your responses on Blackboard and then respond to another student. So that's it. You got any questions? Let me know.